By the power of Grayskull! Oh, it's the wrong one. Thunder! Thunder! Thunder God! Oh! I knew I was worthy. Nailed it! Or should I say, hammer and nailed it.
Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and in this episode of Pop Culture Weapons Analyzed, as you've probably been able to guess, I'll be looking at Mjolnir and Stormbreaker. Look, I know it's a small Stormbreaker, that's all I got at the moment, okay, the real one is bigger, but it gives us the right proportions that we need. When I say proportions, it's smaller, but even by being smaller, it's still the right proportions we need to give it a proper analysis. And believe it or not, there's actually some interesting things that we'll get to discuss when looking at this. Because look, I get it. This isn't meant to be historically accurate. Yet, there are some interesting precedents that we can kind of take from the historical weapons that these are inspired on. And yes, Mjolnir, believe it or not, something of this dimensions, has a historical kind of version, you could say, and I'll tell you what that is. But then we're also going to discuss the actual real dimensions of these weapons that exist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, what would change in terms of how they operate, and of course, how this analysis gets changed when you consider someone with superhuman strength. These are all very important to look at, and that's what we're getting into. So to begin with, I'm going to start with Mjolnir, the classic. And if you think Mjolnir is done in the MCU, my prediction is not by a long shot. I actually think someone's going to remake it. Anyway, so we'll start with Mjolnir. It is wrong to think that Mjolnir is a warhammer. The dimensions are horribly wrong. And it's kind of the trope that we've seen in fantasy, where when you see a warhammer, you see something of insane size and girth as this. When in reality, not counting people with exceptionally amazing superhuman strength, if something was this big, you wouldn't be able to lift it. And we've seen many examples of that when people actually make metal versions of Mjolnir, how insanely heavy they are. No. This is what a historical warhammer actually looked like. And do you see a bit of a difference in proportions? Yeah. For obvious reasons, okay? Real weapons, historically, needed to be able to be lifted, right? And you're not going to be able to lift something like this in the real world. But warhammers absolutely existed historically, but this is what they were like. Now, this is a safe foam version, but the real versions, you can certainly feel the weight in them. They're comparable to an axe, okay? So if you picked up an axe, you would understand some of the weight proportions, but of course it depends on the type of axe, because a lot of wood-cutting axes are too heavy, as we would have seen in my more recent video on battle axes compared to wood axes, and if a battle axe could chop wood. It's actually a really great video, and oddly enough, it hasn't been suggested nearly as much as I think it warrants, because it's such a fun video. So if you haven't checked it out, I'm going to put a card there and a link in the description, because unfortunately, there's a lot of you that actually weren't alerted about it. So go check it out now if you haven't seen it, because it's a fun video. And in that video, I get to show the difference between the weights of, say, a battle axe compared to a wood axe, and that's why you've got to kind of understand. But anyway, if you picked up anything that has a fairly heavy top end, you'll start to get an idea of what an actual battle axe feels like. And what you'll also notice when you use a real battle axe is that they're still maneuverable, okay? They're not overdone. That's why the actual hammerhead is comparably small compared to something like we see in fantasy. But I did say Mjolnir has a real-world equivalent that's far more comparable, and it's not the warhammer that many people assume, because when they look at this, they think it's a warhammer, fantasy warhammer, but they'll generally call it a warhammer, especially the types of ones we see in fantasy. No, Mjolnir is not a warhammer, it's a mallet. Okay? Now, a mallet, on the other hand, is something that has far similar proportions to Mjolnir. Here is a simple rubber mallet that I actually have in my workshop, okay? And you're going to see some similar proportions. Now, of course, this is a modern mallet. Historically, mallets were made out of wood, because sometimes you do need to hammer things, but you don't want to scratch or scuff them, but you need a good solid knock. And also sometimes metal is too expensive, but wood is plentiful. And so the mallet is essentially the wooden hammer. And again, you'll see the proportions much more similar. So we shouldn't think Mjolnir to be a warhammer. It's actually a mallet that is meant to be used in combat. So now let's start to break down what interesting effects that such a weapon, a war mallet, would have. And if you're wondering what the two-handed variant of a mallet is, that is the maul. All right, so you see the mauls? Big, and again, wooden heads. But it seems like when, you know, these things are transferred into fantasy, they just translate it into metal and don't change the size. And like I said, in reality, good luck. So in regards to combat, Mjolnir would have some very interesting kind of effects, because when we look at the historical battlefield, we see an interesting thing happened, where in some cases we do see mauls having been used on the battlefield, but not mallets, or nowhere near as prevalently. And the reason is the old concept behind surface area, okay? If I strike someone with an actual warhammer, even though it's got less weight and force behind it, because that force is concentrated on a smaller surface area, it has a greater impact directly on the exact area or surface that you're striking, because it's not spread out. And so generally, it varies, because the way that you compensate that is just ramp up the weight, all right? But if you are using a wooden mallet that has a more comparable weight to a metal hammer or warhammer, that force is then dispersed over a wider surface area and has far less penetrative and damage capacity. But warhammers, okay, that's why they have a small surface area, and some warhammers actually have a split kind of hammerhead, so it can catch on armor easier, and if you kind of get it on the side, that force is again concentrated on even a smaller surface area. And to really drive that point home, what do? They put a point on it, and that puts the same amount of force, essentially, on a much smaller surface area, and the penetrative power then is very high, and its lethality is really, really strong. So then, why would you want to use the hammer instead of the spike in certain instances? Like, would Thor be better off using an axe, which he eventually does, granted, but like, what about a war pick or something like that? Well, kind of depends on what you want to achieve, but also the force that you can generate. A hammerhead, as opposed to the spike end, can actually transfer more blunt force, concussive energy into a target compared to a spike. When a spike hits, say, a helmet, it might dent the helmet because it's concentrated so much on that small point, and so all that force is concentrated on the small point, which can sometimes help it penetrate, but that's where the energy is going, into the deformation of the steel, not on the actual kinetic movement of a head. And so when you switch that to a flatter head and you hit someone, more of that energy can't get sunk into the steel because it's not deforming the steel. So where does the energy go? Well, it's going to go into forcing the person to move, and therefore they get a far greater concussive shock from a hammer hitting them as opposed to a spike hitting them. And so when you're wearing really heavy armor, sometimes it's more advantageous to hit with the hammerhead as opposed to the spike head. Now that's interesting, because that idea that we've just talked about, now transfer that to something of insane size and weight like Mjolnir. So let's pretend there's an armored opponent next to me here. Now this concept, it applies, but it also might not necessarily be fully relevant because of the insane force and power that would be behind something so heavy. As to the actual weight of Mjolnir, that depends. It's up to debate, okay? It is not the actual weight of, whatever material is in the middle of a white dwarf star or something like that, because that is just insanity. But I'd also say it's much heavier than an object of similar or same size that's made out of steel. And then there's the magical enchantment on it as well, which has funky things. But I'm going to say safely, it's much heavier than steel, not as heavy as, a portion of whatever white dwarf star material that it might have been made of. It's made of uru, is that right, uru? Because Mjolnir was forged in the center or heart of a dying star, not from the center of a dying star. And so again, it's hard to say what the weight of that is. All right, so back to our analogy of this armored opponent, okay? Because there's so much weight behind it, if there was a spike, the armor's not going to stop it, okay? Because there's so much force concentrated on such a small thing. But there are other interesting effects that we could compare it if you hit with this flat end. Because you're hitting with the flat end, it has that interesting effect, as I mentioned before, where so much of the energy gets dispersed into the target, putting more kind of concussive and kinetic energy versus penetrative power, okay? And so if Thor wants to shatter something as opposed to just poking a hole through it, okay, suddenly Mjolnir would actually be a far more effective weapon. Now, there is so much insane power behind Mjolnir because it also has magical energies and stuff like that, that Thor can actually do other kind of things where he grabs the hammer and he smacks it down. And then it kind of creates this huge crater, earth kind of shaking effect all around him. It would be interesting because Mjolnir has such a flat surface area. I could kind of see you would have far more success in achieving such a result because of the flat, really wide surface area that Mjolnir has versus something that had a spike. If he did that with a spike end, it would just get buried really, really deeply into the ground. So if you're actually wanting the amount of power that such a weapon could produce dispersed over a wider area, this is kind of the design that you would go with. I'm assuming there would be other magical effects that help disperse the energy, but having a design like this would assist in it on top of it. And so I actually think the design of Mjolnir actually works really well for someone who has such insane strength, and you would need such, super strength to actually just pick up the thing. Now, I was talking about magical kind of effects. Pretend Mjolnir wasn't magic and you just had someone with superhuman strength who could pick up something like this so heavy. There would be some really, really interesting effects as a result. One would be the center of gravity, depending on how much it weighed. I actually don't know how much something like this would weigh. I'm assuming it would have to weigh at least 50 kilos or something like that. Maybe not 100, but somewhere between 50 and 100, I'm assuming, and if that's overboard. But even if it was less, okay, if you're dealing with something with 20 kilos, okay, when you swing that thing, the amount of inertia that's on this would be insane, that it would pull you off.
Pull me off the...
Oh my God, Emma pulled you off.
The center of balance. You know, the whole thing where Thor spins it and then holds and just launches himself? You kind of get almost that effect. If this was really this heavy and I weighed the same proportionate amount as I'd normally do and I swing it, all right, as soon as it reaches this point, it's going to be pulling me into a whirlwind like that as well because of how crazy heavy it is, but not only heavy, because of the inertia that would have been created in it while it's actually in motion. So it would actually be really unwieldy and hard to use unless you did very specific strikes. So doing wide sweeping swings like this would pull you off your balance and you would no. But lifting and throwing it down, you could control quite well. And so, like I said, if Mjolnir didn't have magical effects and you only had superhuman strength, not other magical things that Thor has and stuff, you're just using a weapon like this, you would be restricted in the way that you fight with it, oftentimes just lift and drop, lift and drop. I'm not saying that wouldn't be a devastating attack. It certainly would be, because, man, imagine, in regards to regular weapons and armor and stuff, very few things would be able to block it. You would have to dodge it, but that's where one of the big weaknesses would be. How fast you could use it. And the telegraphing that could happen because if I have to lift this thing and drop it to hit, you're gonna see it coming from a mile away and it'll be easy to avoid. But if you have superhuman strength, you would be able to use it quicker, but I still think there would be a lot of telegraphing and you would probably, as soon as you lift it over here, you're gonna be like that. That's the thing about superhuman strength. I addressed this in my video on super big swords. If you have just superhuman strength and not superhuman weights, all right, you wouldn't be able to do this if this is more than 50% of your own body weight, because it's not a matter of if you can lift it, it's a matter of your point of balance. You would just tip over because there's no balance, it's extended too far. You'll need to keep it above your center of gravity to actually lift it and hoist it. And only if you had your feet bolted into the ground could you lift something that was super insanely heavy away from your center of gravity like this and remain on your feet. But we don't know what magical effects Thor has in addition to his superhuman strength, which is why we can assume he gets away with it. And we certainly see him doing, big hits like this and stuff. And the hammer is operating to him as if it weighed about the same weight as a regular warhammer. But everyone else getting hit by it is reacting like it weighed a heck of a lot more, which is cool. And then you have whatever magical enchantments that exist in the Mjolnir on top of it, like when you actually hit something, it releasing some type of magical concussive energy, which just shatters opponents and makes them explode. You can do the whole hammer into the ground, big crater effect going everywhere, and him having whatever magical thing is helping him be grounded, okay? And so for Thor, Mjolnir's it's a great weapon, actually. I kind of love it. And especially that you get to see that kind of effect where it's not a weapon that's meant to pierce or to cut, but shatter and cause things to just explode from sheer kinetic energy. Mjolnir, it does the job. On top of that, Mjolnir has that really cool magical effect of when you put it down, only the worthy can pick it up. It's interesting that you know, in the movies at least and things, that came about from an enchantment to determine a worthy user, but it has practical utility, as we see Thor doing, and even in combat. He puts it on Loki when he's on the ground and Loki can't move. There's the dragon thing he does, and he puts it in the dragon's mouth and they can't. Like, that is actually legitimately a profoundly useful tool thing in combat, and I actually think Thor could utilize it way more. I mean, he had trouble fighting his sister Hela, but she was able to make the thing explode, so spoilers if you haven't seen it. But yeah, so I guess he couldn't have done that to Hela, because even if it was on her and she couldn't move, she could destroy the thing. So there's that. And then it makes me wonder, you know, could that have worked against Thanos? Don't know, but still it's a really useful thing that could have been used more. But so there's actually, surprisingly, a lot to analyze and break down in regards to Mjolnir, looking at many different applications about if it was just the size and weight of it without its magical effects, and then with its magical effects, and then using it with super strength versus super strength and other magical things. So that's really cool. So now let's go to Thor's supposed upgrade, and that is Stormbreaker. My Stormbreaker looks a little soft in comparison, honestly. I don't like Stormbreaker's design, honestly. I think it's this bulbous hammerhead. Honestly, I think the design, just aesthetically, on Stormbreaker would be so much better if this huge hammerhead wasn't sticking out like this weird protrusion thing. If it sat closer in to give more prominence to the axe, or I would say, yeah, very good. Now, what's interesting, there is functional utility in Stormbreaker's design in having best of both worlds, essentially, a hammerhead and an axe head. You see, unlike, you know, this mallet kind of, it's not a warhammer, but magical mallet Mjolnir, is that you don't really need two heads, all right? I mean, it rarely gets broken in normal combat and stuff, and so you could just use one, and I don't see, you know, Thor doing any tricky where he hits that and then he hits on the back end or something like that, where you're like, ha-ha, you hit there, then you hit there on the back end or something like that. He's just usually just using a hammerhead. And so you have a whole other end that you could put something really useful on. And they kind of do that with Stormbreaker. In actual fact, we see this mirrored on historical weapons. Here I have my Bector Corbin, and as you see, it's kind of doing double duty. It's got a hammerhead and a spike. Now, I don't have the weapon that is far more historically equivalent to what Stormbreaker really is, because if you look at Stormbreaker, if you want to be technical, it's a type of fantasy poleaxe. A very stylized, but essentially fantasy poleaxe. A poleaxe traditionally has an axe head and a hammerhead. There we go, there's no spike at the top. You know, poleaxes generally have spikes at the top, but my Bector Corbin shows a good comparison because what it's all is missing is the axe head. It has a spike instead. And so it's kind of funny, the classic, you know, pole arm, you know, weapons from the medieval period is that there's kind of a mix. They usually have like a spike or an axe or a hammer or an axe, a spike at the top, or a hooky bit. There's a number of things. But anyway, there is historical precedent for what we're looking at in regards to Stormbreaker, which is cool. So with Stormbreaker still having an actual, you know, hammerhead, you get the options and utility of all the things I just mentioned about Mjolnir, about doing more area kind of concussive damage as opposed to cutting or penetrative damage. So you get all that advantage, but then there might be times in which concussive force isn't enough where you're wasting all that energy over such a wide surface area, especially if you're sending it out through whatever magical means that is on the weapon. And so you might come across an opponent who is so tough that you need to condense all that force onto a fine kind of cutting edge like an axe. And funnily enough, we kind of see that in, you know, Infinity War. The part of the weapon that really does the damage against Thanos is the axe head. So, totally. Now, I remember Thor doing a really big, massive hit in Infinity War, doing a whole kind of concussive area effect. And I can't remember if it was the hammerhead or the axe end, because in my opinion it should have been the hammerhead, and I hope it was. We can double check, okay? And if it's the hammerhead, yes, because that should be the utility. The hammerhead is a big concussive booms, and the axe is for very lethal, more penetrative, you know, slashes, hacks and cuts. Now in regards to the proportions, Stormbreaker is massively overweight, but again, it's kind of the same thing that we see with Mjolnir, is that it's made for someone with superhuman strength. But unlike Mjolnir, there isn't a direct historical comparison like, you know, a Mallet or Maul that has similar girth and just made out of a lighter material. There's no historical precedent that has such girth for a poleaxe like this, because as you see, historical poleaxes, much more conservative in their size, so people could actually lift them and use them. But as we've already covered, and which is why I don't need to recover it here, so that our analysis of Stormbreaker is going to be quicker, Stormbreaker is made for someone with superhuman strength, and so perfectly appropriate and adequate for him, and then you get all those benefits. But there's one thing that Stormbreaker loses that Mjolnir had, and that's the enchantment. It looks like anyone can essentially pick up Stormbreaker, worthy or not. And that means Thor does lose out of that really cool utility, being able to pin people down because they can't pick it up if they're not worthy. There is another massive upgrade in regards to Stormbreaker over Mjolnir, and it is two-handed, because with two-handed, two hands, but also by being longer, the actual striking end is further away, which gives you a bigger lever, which means the actual tip speed is moving much faster for the same rotational speed, okay? Mjolnir is rotating technically as, you know, fast as Stormbreaker, right? But because it's longer, the axe head on Stormbreaker is moving much faster, which means it can generate more force. And so upgrading to two-handed, absolutely brilliant! Thor never really used a shield in conjunction with Mjolnir, and so it makes sense that he used a two-handed weapon. But funnily enough, there are some times in which shields have been used in conjunction with good old Mjolnir, and I think Thor's strong enough that he could one-hand Stormbreaker if he really wanted to, so he gets the option. So all in all, Stormbreaker actually has some really cool upgrades, though I think aesthetically it's a more ugly weapon. But overall, it's far more functional, and technically it's more powerful, and it has more options in combat as well. And so it is an upgrade. I just love the look of good old Mjolnir. It's really cool. But Stormbreaker, it's a good weapon. It's a good weapon, ugly, but great. So there we go. That is my analysis of Thor's weapons from Marvel's MCU, Mjolnir and Stormbreaker. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you have enjoyed, and if you have enjoyed, please leave a comment down below. It actually helps the video out tremendously in getting it promoted in the algorithm. And so if you can't think of anything to write Mjolnir. And if you don't know how to spell it, guess it, because it's spelled really weird, right? But seriously, just a Mjolnir in the comments would help promote this video tremendously. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time. Until then, farewell.